what's an MSP, right? So if you don't have a standard and you don't have a definition, you really can't hold, yeah, I'm an MSP. I mean, what is that, right? So I think there was a lot of confusion about what an MSP was, what an MSP did. And so we really tried to develop some standards and some definitions around that. And I remember I distinctly remember us getting together in San Diego to talk about the definitions of how do we define this and what is it really, so that we can differentiate between commodity resale of a technology, management of a device. And really it boiled down to, being proactive, right?
All right, we are rolling. Mike, thanks for coming on the program. Really appreciate it. For those of you out there who think that the managed services profession just suddenly popped up out of nowhere in the last 10 years, and you're making tons of money and you're thinking, you're at the top of your game and you're following best practices because you go to all the conferences and you listen to a bunch of speakers who seem like they know what they are talking about. And they probably do, but they're talking about best practices and things that MSPs ought to do. Did you ever wonder where that came from? Did you ever wonder maybe that they didn't come up with that themselves, and maybe there was a group of people who actually had to make the rules for the very first time because there were no rules before them? If that's ever crossed your mind, well, listen to this podcast, because you're gonna be really fascinated by this. My guest, who I'm going to introduce now, is if there's a Mount Rushmore, if there's a founding fathers list of MSPs, this gentleman would certainly be in that list. I'll talk about very briefly your CV, which is professional engineer, former MSP CEO and business owner, pioneer of managed services standards and best practices through his work in developing what today is the unified certification standard for cloud and managed service providers. Mike Backers, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Charlie. It was
Mike,
very generous.
did you like that? I worked hard on that. For those of you, we're going to get into what your work is as an MSP, but you started off your life as a professional engineer. What got you from professional engineer to technology and then specifically to managed services? Walk us quickly, if you wouldn't mind, through that.
Sure. Yeah. So part of that was growing up as a Gen X, right? And so prior to the internet and having a Commodore 64 and learning coding and going through college, where when I started, there was no Windows. And by the time I graduated, we were, Intel chips and had Windows. And through my engineering work at college, I was doing civil engineering, a master's in science, and using computing to really do high-end mathematical solutions, right? And so finite element modeling, for example, was pioneered by my master's thesis professor, Milan Belgian, and doing porous medium, basically solving complex groundwater pollution problems, Superfund sites, and modeling through predictive mathematical models and Laplace transforms and all kinds of fantastic mathematical models. Yeah, but using computing to do that. And so getting interested in the hardware, like how long is it going to take me? How many Cokes can I slam while I'm here at 3:00 in the morning waiting for this program to run? So getting into the hardware, understanding what memory was, understanding the RAM, understanding all of the computing coding that went into, basically efficient coding. And so getting out into the engineering world, arriving with a lot of interest in computing.
It was accomplishing your engineering goals through technology that first exposed you to it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
For those sorry, I have to do this because without the date and time context, people aren't going to be really lost here. You already gave yourself away with the Commodore 64. Like, ChatGPT. What's a Commodore 64?
Right.
We're talking early 90s, right?
That's right. Yes. Yep.
Okay. There were MSPs as early as the early 90s. They had very different tool sets. They had narrow pipelines in terms of bandwidth, right? 56K baud modems to work with. When did you get started in your first, what in your
Well, really, it was I went to go work at CompuServe, Network Services, and I would consider them an MSP. We were selling business network during the day, and then people would go home and surf at night. And back then, it was the 33.6 before the 56K modems. So it was all dial-up, and we were using networks that basically were through the airports, the CETA network, airports all around the world in 130 countries to dial up, and for business travelers to be able to connect back to corporate resources. And so I got introduced to a lot of fantastic concepts, but it was all pre-internet. Those X25 networks, but there was some management of the equipment and a lot of, I got exposed to a lot of Fortune 500 companies and Six Sigma and processes, and it was great. So that was kind of my start prior
so
to
so
launching my own
CompuServe?
company. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So serve as a kind of an ISP, but they did some management services as well.
Yeah,
Did you call it?
that's right. Yes. Yeah, basically we were like a little team of about 100 people that took the ISP and turned it into a business back
So is this late 90s?
96,
Okay. So in
97,
the dot
98.
com era, in the
Yes,
beginning of the dot com boom.
that's right. Yes, exactly.
So you're getting exposed to large enterprise customers who are using technology in a very different way than we at the SMB level or mid-market use it today. And that's giving you exposure to how, I mean, where was the leap from I'm selling, kind of connectivity services that have to be managed to I could do this on my own. This is a business model. This is a profession.
Well, there was a boom. All right. So at CompuServe, there was a lot going on in the .com industry at the time. That everybody's familiar with the boom and the bust. And we were exposed to people like John Sidmore with UUNet and Vince Cerf, who created TCP/IP protocols. And back then, the internet was fledgling. So I literally went from 56K modems all the way to OC 192s and hosting on the backbone. And so the learning curve was incredible. And only the most technical people were able to keep up, and found myself at a point where there was so much tumultuous business going on at the time. Just decided to start my own, and did that with a group of people that were highly technical, very good at what they did. And we went out and formed a lot of our partnerships. And I got to meet some incredible people. And some of the technologies that came along through that were just fascinating, right? And I've tons of stories. So
We're gonna get to some of those stories. I do have a question because I don't think I've ever asked you this. Did you call your company an MSP? Did you think of it as an MSP?
barely, I think, until I met you, Charlie. I think it was one of those evenings where I was, working late at night, working on my website, and I called you up. I don't even remember how I found you, and we started talking. And I said, I think I'm an MSP. I'd like to come out to this conference or this meeting that you have. And I think there were 8 of us or 12 of us when I finally got there. But I was coming out. I was joining that together with I was negotiating one of my first partnerships in Redwood Shores.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was December of 2001. It was, I think, 2 months after the 9/11 attacks. And yeah, you called up and said, "Hey, I want to join." And I think I said, I don't think this is a good fit because I think at the time you were like maybe the only person
Yeah.
yet, or
I
maybe
was by
you're,
myself at night. Yeah. Working away. Yeah.
yeah. And so for context, right, that was not typical for us to get, non-enterprise, although your company was absolutely focused on the enterprise. But startups looked very different back then, right? You remember that you had
Yeah.
massive VC funded, you running HP OpenView and all these massive enterprise class software, and you're saying, hey,
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna do stuff a little bit differently. We're gonna have a security focus. I'm gonna get back to that in a moment because your focus on security was decades ahead of its time. But you were kind of unique because of your size. You didn't stay that size. You grew rapidly. But yeah, I remember that call distinctly. You talked your way into the group.
I have a knack for that. Even though I'm an engineer, I tend to think I do okay with people.
So so you have your MSP now at this point. It's the early 2000s, very, very early 2000s. You've had enterprise services experience before this, and you're now exposed. You referenced that meeting in Berkeley, California, I believe it was, and we had I think we had 20 people there, almost all CEOs. You were one of maybe 20. I don't know how many of those companies are around anymore. I mean, honestly, not that many, but you were,
I remember a
and you
few of the
guys were just
names.
talking.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys were
Yeah.
just talking about everything. And imagine that in was that like February, March of 2002, around that time?
Mm-hmm. Yes. That sounds about right.
Do you remember what you guys talked about? Like, I'm trying to think about the topics that came up.
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with the money in the system, the money that was pouring into the technology side of things, right? The Ciscos of the world, for example, the Oracles of the world, right? And all that money was necessary to develop the technology that we were all using to provide services out there, manage these boxes essentially with clients. And the models that were set up for us to use the technology were all based on, I kind of think of it as almost like the car industry, right? So, like you want to go buy an SUV, you don't go to the SUV store, you go to Toyota or a Ford or a Nissan or a Mazda, and it's like, I want an SUV. You're at the Toyota shop. You're gonna buy a Toyota, right? And so, as long as it's Toyota, you can walk out of here. And so this agnostic kind of, okay, I'm gonna talk to my client and provide them the best solution for their business, and it may not be your piece of hardware. And the strong arming that was occurring at the time from the vendors, the sequestration, the financial incentives to be single sourced, all of these. And then on top of it, some of the other topics that were going around was just the incentives in order to get some of these, you want some, we'll go in and sell with you. We'll talk about our technology. We'll give you the latest and greatest code, but you're going to have to give us your clients. And then
Yeah,
sure enough,
explain that, because a lot of people listening to this today, especially if they're younger generation, never lived in a channel, in an IT channel where what you're talking about was as prevalent as it was in the early thousands. Which for everybody out there, what Mike's describing is the very nascent, the beginning of the MSP business model challenging the status quo of the legacy global IT channel. And that, I do remember, Mike, in the Berkeley meeting, a lot of you guys talking about that pressure, and either you go with it or can it be resisted?
well, that's right. I mean, the bottom line is I've got a really complicated piece of technology that's cutting edge that can do a lot of things. And I'm going to bring it to you, Mr. IT director. Here, implement this. Well, I don't know what your technology does. Do you have some support around this? Can you help me install it? Well, we build the boxes. You do the work. Here's a 1-800. Well, the vendors didn't really like that. The box makers, the technology companies didn't really like that transaction. So they had resellers like the car dealer interfacing with the clients. They were out there calling all day. And these were like shops where you'd have 100 people with phones just calling all day. hey, you need to get connectivity. We've got this box, it's going to be this much. And it was very commoditized. And they were trying to sell, it was a technology sale. And it was, the people selling were very, very smart about all the gadgets and all the things it could do. But then once you got it to the client, there was still, now I got to plug it in and try to make this thing work. And so that's where the MSP, that's where the management of these pieces of equipment came along. I'll manage it for you. I'll keep up with the technology. I will stay on top of this technology. You go manage your business. I'll stay on top of the technology. In doing all of that, at some point, you would get, for the sale of the equipment, you'd get 5% of the sale. So it was a $100,000 piece of equipment, you'd get 5%.
Not that much. Yeah.
No, not that much. So the management, you're like, hey, on top of selling it to you, now I'm going to manage it each day, 24 hours a day. I'm going to monitor the thing, manage it. If it breaks, you got people all over the world that need access to this device. We're going to provide that for you. And in doing so, you basically establish a very tight relationship, a trusted relationship with that client.
More so than the vendor, in your
Much
opinion?
more so than the vendor, right? And the people, what we found was that people really didn't, the only reason there was an affinity to a particular vendor, a particular technology, is because you couldn't learn them all, right? If you were an IT director, it was like, I'm going to standardize on Microsoft and I'm going to standardize on Cisco, and I can't learn all the other stuff, even though some other technology might be exactly what I need. So we were able to come in and provide exactly what they needed and manage it for them so they didn't have to learn all those things. Well, the vendors didn't like that because they wanted to continue the role of their technology into that client, and especially if it was a bigger client. So the enterprise clients, definitely. And so when you had an enterprise client, they had direct salespeople going into the bigger clients, and they just cut you on price, right?
Yeah.
So we just said, we're not selling any gear. We're just going to manage it. We'll just walk in, we'll take a look at what you got, we'll manage it for you. Because we got out of that because it was ridiculous.
So you stopped being an advocate for what gear they were going to get. You were saying, buy the gear and we'll manage it. Is that, first of all, is that correct? And then what did that do to the relationship between you and the client?
Well, it's fantastic, right? Because they were like, thank you. Right. What else do you recommend? And of course, the vendors didn't like that either, right? So there was an adversarial relationship there. So a lot of the conversations, that first meeting was about this, and the money that was pouring into Silicon Valley at that time was astronomical. So
Sure.
you couldn't, it was swimming upstream, for sure.
But okay. And I look, it's easy to say over 20 years, look where we are today, and you won. Your model won, hands down. I mean, undeniably so. But back then, it was a very different proposition because you were in the fight, you were in the weeds, and it was very tough. And I believe me, I know we had many conversations about, is this the right thing to do? Is to challenge the status quo of just let the vendor dictate it. And it wasn't that the vendors had, it wasn't us versus them, but it was the struggle for the independence of the MSP professional to be able to say, I am not just an agent for a particular brand company. I am here to represent your interests as the customer. And that was really a new concept that we'd never seen before that I'm aware of.
Yeah. And I think, Charlie, really what we determined through there was that there was a very niche market, which was the SMB marketplace, right? The small to medium business, the Fortune 2000s, the 500s, they had their own IT department. The vendors were in there all the time. And there was less of a need for us there and much more and it matched the size of and the capabilities of our company and a lot of the MSPs to be in a more of a, 2,000 to 5,000 employee company kind of range. And those companies had less resources and needed more managed services. And so it became kind of more of a symbiosis rather than a rub, right?
So in that backdrop of of you and a few others, and it's safe to say, like I think at that time, like 2002, our membership was maybe like in the, I think you were like in the first 10 to join, I want to say maybe, and then we might have gotten to like 50 or 100 sometime in 2002, and even out of that group, it wasn't like what, I don't want to call it your philosophy, because you were not the only one espousing it,
Right.
but you certainly were a champion, and you believed in it. It was a small enclave, I would say, who believed in that kind of concept of, look, the MSP should have, if not autonomy, then certainly should have the ability to speak freely with their customer and say, look, there are a lot of different vendors. I'm going to give you what I think you should have, and don't just take what the vendor rep says that you should have. Out of that context, in 2000, and I think it was early 2004, and it may have been in Vegas, and we may not have been in our right mind after that conference. If this is when it came up, someone brought up the idea of, why don't we build a standard? What are your recollections, an MSP standard? Do you ever remember any recollection of that?
Yeah, I think I do. And there was a short-lived um, consumer buyer's guide that we
Yes.
developed, and these are qualifying questions that we said, hey, let's give the clients some questions to ask, um, the public, so that when they walk in, they're asking appropriate questions that might flesh out what type of service they may get, because there weren't any standards. The only certifications were very specific to the technology and the vendor boxes or software. So lack of standards, lack of licensures, lack of certifications that were in the industry. And so we thought, well, we'll give them some qualifying questions. We started there. And then, we continued to flesh that. I think very early on, one of the first things we did was a code of ethics.
Yeah, you're
And
right.
and that was very proud of that. And what was interesting about it is, being a licensed engineer, I think part of that cohort, we had a doctor, an attorney, a CPA, an engineer. And I started looking around the room. I was like, no wonder these professionals who have experienced codes of ethics in their industries, they're licensed professionals in their industries. Maybe the IT industry needs something like this.
So you're talking about the executives who were employees and or owners. A lot of them were owners of MSP businesses themselves, like you.
Yeah.
But they all came from professional backgrounds. That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that was hugely influential.
So those things kind of flowed toward, a standard
Did
certification.
did were you experiencing at that time? And I'm going to say again, for just sake of argument, I think early, at least first half of 2004. So that time period leading up to that, were you experiencing difficulty in the market with people claiming to be MSPs when they actually didn't have the technical expertise to do the things that you were doing and other professional MSPs were doing?
What's an MSP? Right. So if you don't have a standard and you don't have a definition, you really can't hold, yeah, I'm an MSP. I mean, what is that? Right. So I think there was a lot of confusion about what an MSP was, what an MSP did. And so we really tried to develop some standards and some definitions around that. And I remember I distinctly remember us getting together in San Diego to talk about the definitions of how do we define this and what is it really, so that we can differentiate between commodity resale of a technology, management of a device. And really it boiled down to, being proactive, right?
Yep.
So, and having a reliable, standard, repeatable kind of experience out of essentially a service, right? And the ethics were wrapped around that, as well as, some transparency so that you weren't portraying your services, your security, your your entire setup as something it wasn't, right? That you're reselling somebody else. There was a lot of offshoring. With the internet, things spread out all over the place, and security was lax. People were not excellent in their own shop, and that they were managing other people's and portraying themselves as secure. There's a lot of garbage going around. And so
Yep.
I think part of our concern was if we're going to invest in this nomenclature, managed service provider, then we ought to protect it a little bit with some standards.
So the whole experience, the whole process of creating what became the UCS, I think lasted at least a year. So full 12 months, maybe a little bit longer from start to finish until we actually had something that was capable of being published. So much went into that. I don't want to get into a year long of what happened, but it, not unlike the Constitution of the United States or the Bill of Rights, it was an important document, and a lot of opinions were represented. What were some of your recollections of the major themes that people wanted to be represented in an MSP framework or MSP standard?
Well, just to also give you some other context about the timing, I remember Sarbanes-Oxley came along,
Yep.
Gramm-Leach-Bliley came along. So there was the Spam Act came along. So there was a lot of, with the advent of the internet, Congress was getting involved, the states were getting involved. There was a threat of literally having the entire industry codified by lawmakers who knew nothing about what we did. And in addition to that, making it some, strange, slow moving thing when IT is literally day by day changing, right? So that wasn't the solution. So we had to get involved there as well. And so the standard was also, it was prescient. We had to get on it and get it done. And so
Was it
some
was
of
it
the
a
things,
concern that if you didn't act, others would?
oh, of course, yeah,
Okay.
because it was starting to become the Wild West, right? The
Yeah.
internet was becoming the security breaches were big. And so people were exfiltrating huge data, Homeland Security. I went and met with a few governors. I talked to them about some of the technology I provided to provide. I even offered it for free to the states, some of these things. And they were like, whoa, we don't want to take that responsibility. We'd rather just let people's stuff get stolen. It's pretty terrible because they didn't understand it at all.
Yeah.
A lot of the Homeland Security directors were old sheriffs. There was just not a lot of understanding at the time. And so some of the things that were important to us were the engineering practices. Just the day-to-day engineering practices within the MSP itself, the audit procedures, the safety, the backups of customer configurations, essentially, hey, I made a change to client's software and everything broke. Okay, not a problem. We'll just put the last version back on. It'll keep working. We're in the maintenance window. What went wrong, right? And we see this now and again where the whole internet goes out on the Eastern Seaboard. And it was because somebody made a change or like, hey, we got to roll that back. So sometimes things break and we don't know why, right? We think we've got it all tested. So some of those things were revolved around that. Some of it was physical security and who can get, because remember we had secure tunnels into a lot of clients' networks that were managed by security personnel. So not just the procedures, but the physical security to those locations.
Hugely important.
Very important. Essentially in the construction or engineering world, we call that lockout tagout, right? It's, and so just financial stability of companies, how people are getting things done. Basically, is it through a joint venture? If it is, are you outsourcing a part of this? If you are, be transparent about that when you're talking to your clients. Right? So
Yeah.
transparency, ethics, all those kind of things. That's what we're
When
worried about.
it's easier today with so many global cybersecurity frameworks, which are all good, but none of them were designed to be MSP frameworks. There's sometimes a confusion today about those frameworks and what are considered MSP best practices, or what are is codified into the UCS as you and others did. At that time, there was no, I mean, there were a few ISO frameworks out.
Yeah.
There was ITSM, out of England, that was just barely coming through Canada, coming down into the US, but it hadn't really been
CompTIA
adopted.
comes to mind, right? There was
CompTIA was doing a lot in the individual certification front,
right.
really good work. But again, nobody had addressed or started to tackle the issue that you guys did, looking at the MSP organization as a whole.
It was an organization-wide cert that we were looking for, not an individual
that was really unique. And I don't know if we just started, but I think that we said, look, this is not going to be an individual cert. I mean, I think someone said very early on, like, this is not something that an individual cert could address. You guys wanted to do it at an organizational level. And you said there's nothing else out there that speaks to what we do, meaning there was a lot of gaps, but you still had a lot of other frameworks to draw from.
Yes.
I think that's true.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Any come to mind? Like, I mean, you mentioned COVID, Six Sigma, like.
I think all of our experiences, right, and the things that we did in our own practices really were what informed, right? And there was, I want to say, at least 8 individuals that were really heavily into it, and probably 20 or 25 people that contributed, right?
Yeah,
and
I think that's about right.
And then the editing and a lot of that stuff was done by a few.
I remember a lot of long nights. Yeah.
Over hamburgers.
So to summarize, you and the others wanted to create a framework that was unique to MSPs, purpose-built for MSPs, designed to address the core issue of what is an MSP, what are managed services, and through that, attempt to give customers some real positive, affirmative guidance about not who they should pick, but how they should go about asking and vetting MSPs, so they could tell for themselves what's good and what's maybe not so good. Fair way to put it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think back kind of to our early conversation about college, right? When I was in college, there was no computer science degrees, right? And I went out to DC one time to go talk to the National Council of Engineering about adding computer science to the licensure for engineering to see if that could be an avenue. And they were very intrigued by it. And there was some testing of this, a pilot of this in Texas, and 2004 or 5 or something like that. So we were all looking for, it was one of those things that we continued to search for it. We would have just adopted it, but we had to create it at the end of the day, is what ended up.
Well, I mean, you may not be aware of this, but I mean, that standard is now held by, I don't know how many, probably thousands of MSPs have gone through it over the 20 years. It's now on 5 continents actively, like today, MSPs all over the world have it. So, I mean, the work transcends, what you and the others put into it all those years ago. And yeah, I just remember that was it was a transformative event, and not that many people know about it. And that's why I really wanted you to be on the program, kind of, as a testament to it actually did happen, right? It wasn't just like made up.
Didn't just
like Moses went up on the rock and the 10 commandments came down.
There were some people that dug the well that were drinking from.
Absolutely, yeah. I would love to have you back on just to talk about the channel politics aspect, because I mean, I think that that's like another hour conversation. I know the San Jose MSP World Conference, maybe in 2006, 2007, when someone in the audience, basically stood up and said, my whole honeymoon was paid for by vendor X. Just paid my honeymoon so I would represent their brand. And we were privy to a lot of unspoken things that had never been reported before.
Right. Yeah. Get that person a copy of the ethics and read it to him. Right.
Yeah, no doubt. But on behalf of a lot of MSPs out there who didn't know that you existed, a lot of people know who you are, but some people may not know that your
Where'd that guy come from? Yeah.
Yeah. Who is he again?
Why is he here?
I mean, you and the others really, were champions and wanted this to happen. And you said, look, let's make it happen. This is going to happen. And future MSPs are going to thank us. I don't even know if you thought that I thought you wanted it to happen for the modern day MSPs, but I think it has far transcended your generation.
Yeah. No, I think it was all necessary and part of what we were doing, advocating for ourselves, selling ourselves, portraying ourselves as what we were, which was different and new. And I've watched the whole industry move in and out of different trends. I think I was telling somebody, about the whole idea of the cloud. And I was like, hey, the cloud was this symbol we used in Visio, right? Which is no longer around. It's been bought by Microsoft, but that was what we used with a lightning bolt. And that was, what an internet connection was. And so this whole terminology of the cloud just came from this. We used to draw pictures and for clients, and that's where it came from. I think it has come a very long way, and it's pretty interesting. There's a little ebb and flow, but the bottom line is the MSPs that I've seen that have been most successful have been the ones that differentiate themselves and do hard work. It's not a pricing mechanism. It's not subscription. There's a lot of like, hey, you'll be an MSP in a box. You just sign up with us and turn this on and you'll be an MSP. And there's because it's attractive, right? Look at all these successful people. But the ones that have sticking power really do the work. And,
well, on behalf of all MSPs, Mike, really appreciate the hard work that you did and that few select group of long ago who had the foresight to realize these are important, these are tough questions to address. They had to be asked and they had to be reconciled with where the future of what you and I and others wanted to, and I think appropriately so, wanted to classify as a profession, not just some random assembly of technologists, but people and organizations who had very serious work to do, very important work to do. And today, I think that work is even more critical. MSPs are the frontline defenders in this battlefield called the cyber war. So who knew? Who knew it would be that influential?
We did.
But you did. We did.
We knew it was
Mike
coming.
Backers, appreciate you coming on the MSPZone. I think I'd love to have you on again, and we'll talk about some of the channel politics that people don't talk about anymore because it's kind of ancient history, but people need to know these stories. So I appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie.